Hello again. This is Nick Schrammick and Howard Chao with Dune Insights and our podcast, What's Next In? And this episode, we are talking to the founder of Xona. So Xona is a next generation high precision GPS that uses a series of low Earth orbit satellites. And this will enable the next generation of connected technology. Howard, you spoke to the founder of Xona. What did you think about this company?
I think it's a very exciting company. It has a terrific team, comes from very strong backgrounds. And the concept itself is really next generation GPS. It's going to enable a lot of new things, including I think it's going to help move forward autonomy, but it has a lot of other use applications as well. It's already starting to be operational. They've launched, I think, 30 or 40 satellites, but they intend to eventually launch, I think, 300, but they're well on their way to it. It is unusual because it's capital intensive, and they're going to have to raise a lot of money, but that's the nature of things for this type of business. But I think you'll be impressed with the founder and the concept. So here it is.
All right, let's go ahead and get right into it. Here is Howard and the founder of Xona.
Today I have with me Brian Manning of Xona Space Systems, and also Reilly Brennan, who is one of the pioneers of auto and mobility tech investing with Trucks Venture Capital. Reilly has been with us at Bonnie many times from the early years. So very delighted to have Reilly with us today. He will be co-interviewing with me. And I'd like to ask Reilly to just introduce himself briefly at the beginning here.
Sure. Thanks again, Howard, for putting on this wonderful event. And good to see you, Brian. So for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Reilly Brennan. I'm one of the founders of Trucks Venture Capital. We're a really focused early stage fund, only doing transportation investments, and based in San Francisco, founded in 2015. And although I think a lot of our background is automotive, our fund has done quite a bit in what we kind of describe as the broader transportation landscape. So aerospace, trucking, aviation, energy distribution systems, bicycles. So kind of anything that moves people or goods, and increasingly stuff that's pretty high up there in the air, and why we were excited about being an investor in Xona and also talking to Brian today. So thanks, Howard.
Terrific. Okay, turning to Xona. So Brian, if you could give us kind of the potted version of the origin history of Xona and also a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. So my name's Brian Manning, the CEO here at Xona. Like I said, very, the kind of elevator pitch on who we are and what we're up to. What we're building can most succinctly be described as, commercial super GPS, designed and optimized around automotive needs in the commercial marketplace. And so we've been utilizing, my background, I came from automotive engines and SpaceX. So our founding team actually has 8 founders. It's kind of an oddly large founding team, but we're building kind of an oddly large big thing here. We all met back about 10 years ago at Stanford doing aerospace degrees. After that, everyone kind of split with their different directions. Some of us went in the new space world, some went in automotive, some stuck around to do PhDs. So we fast forward a few years, our CTO, Dr. Tyler Reed, he did his PhD studying, how you could use what's going on in the new space world with private companies launching these large constellations of small satellites, and how you could use that to build essentially a new generation of GPS optimized for commercial and automotive worlds. After that, he went to work at Ford in their autonomous vehicle division, and there he was responsible for developing kind of the standards for what a navigation system for autonomous systems would need to do and how it would need to perform. And the other part of that was actually kind of a technology scout and figuring, okay, what technologies are out there that can actually meet these needs. And so he wrote some of the, I guess, kind of most widely accepted standards for what performance, a navigation system for an advanced, ADAS or autonomous vehicle would need, but then was kind of finding that there's really not much tech that can meet those needs. So he was the one that kind of started circling the wagon and pulling all the folks back together and saying, hey, with what's going on in new space with these small satellites, I think we really can build something unlike anything that's been built before to solve this need. And that was 3 years ago. We've been off and running with it ever since.
Terrific. So your story is fairly complicated. You're not just a widget manufacturer, Brian, so we're going to have to unpack this.
Sure.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit first about how your system works. What are the components of your system?
Yeah, so GPS, I mean, everyone knows of GPS as, a little blue dot on your phone, and the satellites do tend to get all of the fame and glory, but GPS is a monster. And really GPS is all about precision timing. So a lot of our core IP and our patents is around what we call our distributed atomic clock architecture. And that allows us to synchronize all of our satellites with extreme precision without having to have these big, expensive cesium, rubidium atomic clocks on board that GPS has. And the reason that's important is that in GPS terms, 1 nanosecond, so even a nanosecond of error translates into about a foot of position error. So when you're trying to provide a system with sub 10 centimeter positioning, your timing synchronization on your satellites has to be almost perfect. And so our core tech is basically allows us to go from what we would call an on-premise solution to a cloud solution for atomic clocks. And that's what allows us to use these small low-cost satellites instead of the classic, kind of really big ones like GPS has. I will say that that's only one piece of the system though, and that's, we've had to create innovations across the whole chain, including the control segment, the user segment, signal design, because nobody's ever built a commercial satellite navigation system before. So there's really nothing sitting on the shelf for us. That does mean we've also built up a pretty big patent portfolio, which is laid out quite a minefield for any new entrants to come chase us down on it also.
I have a question for you, Brian. So could you kind of describe the fundamental differences between, old space and new space? I think, it feels like in the last 5 years, there's been a much different approach. And I'd love for you to kind of describe what you see between, kind of the old world. I was a child of the 80s, grew up loving, shuttle and stuff like that, to new space today.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say the old space, or we like to call proven space, the stuff that's been there for a while. Launch costs tended to be the kind of outlier, just massive cost on the sheet. And so what that means is you have systems that tend to optimize for minimum number of launches, maximum lifetime, et cetera. So you end up with fairly large monolithic satellites that have a lifetime of say 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And again, that's because that's what made sense. In the newer space world, one of the biggest things that's really changed is cost of access to space. So with companies like like former employer SpaceX and reusable launch, the cost of launch is no longer this massive outlier. It's just kind of another line on the sheet. And so you see companies, when you start optimizing for total cost of ownership and cost of systems, the more, I guess, affordable method of doing things is smaller satellites using lower cost components that have shorter lifetime and maybe lower reliability, but just launching more of them and launching them more often to get to the same level of, I guess, service reliability on the ground. And so that's kind of the big shift that we've seen a lot of, pretty much all industries in space moving towards, except navigation. And that's kind of where we're tapping into to bring that mentality to the navigation world as well.
So how does that mentality translate into your particular platform? How many satellites do you need?
Yep.
How big is this?
For sure. So the GPS, I guess, kind of by comparison, GPS has about 30 satellites that are around 20,000 kilometers away from Earth, so about an Earth and a half away from Earth. They're big, expensive satellites. I mean, they're several $100 million a satellite. They do a lot of things, and they do a lot of things very well. And it's built around a military architecture, and it serves it very well, and it can serve a lot of civilian needs also. Our system, instead of being 30 satellites really far away, we're closer to 300 satellites that are up only about 1,000 kilometers away from Earth, so about 20 times closer to Earth. And ours are much much smaller, low-cost satellites, more similar to what you're seeing launching for kind of compared to, say, a Starlink and whatnot, launching with the communication satellites.
Oh, but that's a lot of satellites. It sounds like a very ambitious and potentially capital-intensive project, right? And maybe you can talk about how that rolls out. Yeah,
for sure. We've certainly, even a couple hundred satellites, even in current costs, it's still no small effort. And that that is kind of, we learned that very early on, I guess, in our pitches. And, we can't walk in and tell anyone, say, hey, we need 300 satellites before we get any revenue. That method doesn't work very well. So we've come up with essentially a phased rollout strategy where with only tens of satellites, we can already start providing services even on a global basis, and that allows us to essentially in the early days work as a kind of enhancement to GPS. And as you grow, it becomes more of an enhancement and almost something that can operate as a completely independent alternative to GPS as we get more satellites up.
Right. So you do have a phased rollout plan, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the economics of this. Then, how does it work from a capital point of view and from a revenue point of view?
Yeah, and so our phase one fires up with around 40 satellites, and so I mean, it is a several $100 million program to get this full constellation up and rolling. We haven't been shy about that. That being said, costs are continuing to decrease as we move along. With that phase one, we have at least one satellite in view, and so you can start in, I guess, over like 90% of the population. And so at that point, you can start providing GNSS enhancements, and that in many ways matches and even many ways exceeds what is available for state-of-the-art GNSS enhancement services today. So that's a market that we already start tapping into. And as we get more satellites up and grow, our services start to just continually increase in value and coverage area from there.
Brian, could you talk about the targets you're trying to hit for customers? So, if GPS as we know it today is free and maybe not and somewhat imperfect, what is going to be better than GPS that you can prove demonstrably where a customer says, okay, now I understand I need to pay you for this because it's so much better? What's kind of the performance threshold you're trying to hit?
Yeah, what can you do different? What is it that vehicles can do now with your system that they could not do before?
Yeah, for sure. So our system was, again, this is a lot of what Tyler worked on at Ford, and our system was really designed around the needs of automotive autonomy world. That doesn't mean we're necessarily tied to autonomy. Even driver assist and other features can certainly take advantage of what we're building. And I will say, outside of automotive, what we found is that if you can meet the needs of the automotive world in terms of accuracy and resilience and availability, that umbrella is just about everything else out there, including agriculture, construction, mobile phones, drones, even government applications. And so what we're, I guess, filling in, GPS, I mean, taking out the waiver, GPS is a phenomenal service in what it can provide. GPS can generally, though, give you, let's call it accuracy to give you an idea of what road you're on. And so in the automotive world, there's kind of 3 levels of accuracy that we look at, which is what road are you on, what lane are you in, and where are you in that actual lane. And each one of those unlocks more and different capabilities, from things like geofencing to what road you're on, to fencing to, okay, what capabilities can you do in the fast lane or in the autonomous lane or whatnot in the future, perhaps, to things like safe lane keeping. And if you can't see the lane lines in a snowstorm, and your perception is blocked and everything else, can you keep the car safely in the lane? And GPS today is okay at saying what road you're on, but even for driver assist features, for example, GM has announced collaboration with Trimble for GPS corrections, because GPS alone isn't even accurate enough to safely tell you what road you're on. And you can think of it, if you're on the highway and you have a free kind of a service road alongside of you, if you're going 75 miles an hour down the service road, you might have a real problem. And so our service is really designed to give, going from fairly reliable, what road are you on, to extremely reliable, where are you in the lane, and also from a very small, low cost user equipment.
Let's talk about the competitive set real quick, if you don't mind. So, an alternative to GPS is using some of these kind of, Earth-based sort of extra positioning companies. Yep. And can you talk about a few of them and maybe how you guys will leapfrog them or have performance that's better than them?
Yeah, for sure. It's I guess I'll kind of answer both sides of that. So direct competition, there's really not too many out there. The biggest direct competition is actually a company called Geely in China, which is one of the big automotive giants. when we launched our first demo satellite in May, we became the first ever privately funded company to launch a satellite navigation mission, as far as we know. About 6 days later, Geely launched like 9 of their own satellites too. So we were in kind of a race with them to production. But yeah, to your point, that the closest indirect competition is from correction services. And these are systems that monitor the GPS signal with kind of a terrestrial network. And then they send the user additional information over either a cellular link or a SATCOM link. And that gives the user information on effectively how to dig down deeper into the GPS signal to extract more information to try and get higher accuracy. The real challenge with that, though, is that the GPS signal is already some like 10,000 times weaker than a cell signal. So it's a very fragile signal. It's very easy to disrupt. And so, unless you're somewhere like in the middle of a farm field where you have, perfect view of all the satellites, and this is actually really where many of the correction services were designed for, was farming and agriculture, and getting those nice straight crop rows. Unless you have that perfect kind of conditions for GPS, the correction services can really struggle to actually be clear enough and have a clear enough GPS signal to get down to that high accuracy. And so the real world availability tends to suffer on them. And so the big difference with our service is that we're not just correcting the existing GPS signals. We're the first company to actually add in, with our signal, a new, separate, more powerful, more robust signal that doesn't really need to be corrected, because all of the, I say, corrections were done on the satellite and at the infrastructure level instead of pushing it down to the user.
Cool. So I'm going to ask Reilly a question as one of your investors. So Reilly, when you made this investment, what were you thinking in terms of how this technology could help us get to L4 or L5 autonomous driving? Or what's the connection between this technology and autonomous driving?
Yeah, I mean, well, the interesting part, I think, is that there's a lot of services that need better positioning, whether it's delivery or ADAS, even outside of AV. And AV, for us, we've been probably more focused on structured autonomy, particularly industrial stuff, whether it's ag, mining, construction, logistics, more than robotaxi.
Okay.
Robotaxi definitely is in need of this, but there's a whole range of things that better positioning kind of unlocks. So for us, it seemed relatively fundamental that we have to look at ideas there. And the Xona team, pretty impressive, given Brian sort of downplayed a little bit the experience of the 8 founders, but it's pretty fantastic. So I think increasingly we're going to see things that are in low Earth orbit having a real impact on autonomy in the vehicle space. My general rubric is that most automotive executives follow what Elon Musk does, anywhere between 1 and 5 years in delay. And so you can only imagine 5 years from now, the executives at, global automakers who are trying to launch satellites either for comms purposes or positioning or something like that. And we think Xona will be an amazing asset.
Perfect. So we're running short on time here, but there are 2 areas that we definitely need to cover. One is traction, and the other is your capital formation situation. So maybe, Brian, you can tell us a little bit about what you can tell us about the traction you've achieved so far.
Yeah, it's so we do have quite a few different GPS equipment manufacturers who are either evaluating or already have begun integrating our service into their devices, and that covers a range of industries. Anything from high performance devices that serve more agriculture and surveying, to automotive, and even some folks that are developing stuff for cell phone and mass mobile. So one of our investors is also Toyota Ventures, as well as Lockheed Martin, and those have both been very helpful, along with trucks and some other investors, in connecting us in with a lot of the relevant customers. We just got back from Germany that we're a finalist in a competition with Mercedes, which we're really excited about that, to see the interest from their side as well. Outside of that, so we do have several pilot programs that we're firing up, both on the government side as well as private side. We have seen a lot of interest in the government sector as well. That we've already brought in several $1 million on contracts and grants from both the U.S. and Canadian governments. And I guess leads into your second question there on the funding side of things. So we've brought in around 25 million total to date, and that's now that we've crossed off many of the major tech development hurdles, we're moving the ball down the court and starting to build up the full production system. So we haven't opened up the next round just yet, or even an official size target, but it'll be the first, starting to build and fund a full constellation type round. So as soon as a few more pieces fall into place, we'll start opening that up here in probably the next month or two.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to let Reilly ask the last question if you have one. I mean, is there anything else that we should be probing Brian about, Reilly?
Yeah. So I guess the final question would be, positioning for AVs is kind of an obvious one. What are some of the things that when you dream about the opportunities that an entrepreneur or company can unlock, with Xona 5-10 years from now? What are some of the things that are kind of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if they use us for that? Anything kind of on the Xona vision board that you can share with us?
There's all sorts of stuff, and it keeps popping up. I do think mass mobile has a lot of potential beyond even what we've seen today. And the same with that, GPS is an entire ecosystem. And GPS was never designed to tell you where a taxi cab is or anything, but without it, Uber doesn't exist, Lyft doesn't exist, DoorDash doesn't exist, and all these other pieces don't exist. And in my mind, what can the world start to do when very reliable 10 centimeter? I mean, that's the width of your hand. So what can the world start to do? What can the world of app designers start to do when you give them that level of performance, on a reliable global basis? That I think we're still just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and that in a couple of years, even the big guys that have already started to take notice, this can unlock just all sort. I mean, imagine you could map the entire world. Okay, and the average height of somebody's pocket is 3 feet off the ground. If you take that data at the accuracy we can provide, you can create a 3D map of the entire world overnight. It's like there's all sorts of just really exciting things that are out there that we just haven't thought about, just because we don't have the tools to really think about them yet.
So cool. Thanks, Brian.
That's really cool. I think this has been great.
Awesome. No, thank you so much.
Guys.